questions about the technology, if you're having issues with the sound, just put a question in the comments, the chat bar. Hi, Michael. Thanks for coming. Going to get started in just a second. I can see there's a bunch of people that have just showed up. Excellent. Good. We're going to get started right on time. Good. Thanks, Jonathan. Thanks, Christy. Thanks, Deanne. Yep, I guess the sound's coming through loud and clear because Michael is able to detect my Australian accent. So we'll take that as a win. Good. All right. So thanks everyone for joining. I guess we'll have a few more people come in the next few minutes. Just some housekeeping items here. This is an interactive webinar. We're going to take questions through the chat, which you should be able to see on the lower right area of your screen, a little chat box. You can just type your questions in there. Brittany and I will be checking back in that chat section throughout and try and answer as many of your questions as we can throughout the webinar. We are going to be recording the webinar and we'll send it out to everyone who has registered today. And if you're having some issues with audio, just put it in the chat box and Drada on the team will try and help you out. So we have a 2-person team today presenting this topic on third-party retailers on Amazon. Myself, yes, I'm the one with the Australian accent, so you should be able to tell us apart because Brittany's American. But I'm the founder of Bobsled Marketing. And just a little bit of backstory, if you're not familiar with Bobsled or myself, I started Bobsled back in early 2015 after a career in banking, most recently at JP Chase, where I was a commercial banker. And during my corporate career, I obviously was a little bit bored or needed an outlet for my creative endeavors. So I started an e-commerce business on the side in the crafts category and eventually launched those products on Amazon. And that was back in 2013, 14. Even back then, Amazon was difficult to navigate. There was so much to familiarize with the terminology and the rules and the best practices. And I could see how larger brands, some of whom were my clients at the bank, were finding there's a widening gap between what Amazon themselves were directly able to provide with support and help and service to these brands, and what brands really needed to figure out the Amazon channel and have the best chance of success there. So I saw this gap emerging between Amazon and the vendors that it had, and decided that was an area that I would be able to jump in and help out with. And so Bobsled has grown from a 1-person operation back in 2015 with just me to a team of 25 Amazon project managers, account specialists, PPC managers, and data folks. So this is the area that we occupy in the Amazon ecosystem, helping brands with their Amazon channel. So today I head up Bobsled as the CEO. I also co-host a podcast called the E-commerce Brain Trust, and I write a weekly column on Forbes.com about Amazon. And so Britt, would you just give us a quick intro of who you are and what you do?
Yeah, you bet. I'm the sales manager here at Bobsled Marketing, which means I get to work pretty closely with brands looking to amend or add a layer of strategy to their current Amazon presence, as well as partner with brands that are looking to launch on Amazon. In my previous life, I worked at one of the largest third-party retailers on Amazon.com. And in partnering with my brands, I had the chance to really learn and experience a variety of business models that were created specifically for Amazon. So it really gave me the chance to absorb an understanding of both brand management and Amazon management, as well as grasp how like a third-party retailer plays into this Amazon ecosystem. But at Bobsled, I do act as one of the first touch points for a brand looking for an agency partner and setting up consultations to better understand a brand's goal for Amazon, and finding a strategy that really meets their expectations and needs.
Good stuff. Thank you for that. So I already mentioned a lot of our background as a company. Bobsled started 4 years ago. We do work with vendors and sellers across Amazon's key Western markets, so US, Canada, Australia, EU, and the UK. And as Amazon has really invested in their advertising platform, our entire PPC team is certified with Amazon advertising, both DSP and PPC side of the house. Here are some brands that we've worked with over time. There is really a variety here across baby, apparel, home, consumer technology, personal care products. We've really worked with across any kind of product category that is eligible to be sold on Amazon, both vendors and sellers. And today, this is what we're here for today. We're talking about third-party retailers and the business model of a third-party retailer, why brands would decide to work with a third-party retailer, pros and cons, and alternative models for brands to grow their Amazon sales channel. So I do want to point out just right at the top of the webinar here that Bobsled Marketing is not a third-party retailer. Our business model is to work on behalf of the brands that we engage with, and we access their seller central channel or their vendor central channel and work on their behalf. Whereas a third-party retailer, Britt's about to get into their explanation here, but they have a different operating model. And so our intention here with this webinar is not to trash the third-party retailer model, but just talk about, there are a variety of options here when it comes to brands maintaining and optimizing their Amazon channel. Third-party retailers have there's specific pros and cons that we're going to get into, but I just wanted to make that clear that we're not out to trash anyone here. It is just one of many models worth considering for brands. So with that, Brittany, would you give us sort of what is a third-party retailer for the purpose of this conversation?
Sure. So let's kind of review the 3 primary sellers that are in the Amazon ecosystem, and one of which is a retailer. So we'll go down the list here just to make it easy. But the first selling entity is a vendor, which essentially means a branded manufacturer is selling their products directly to Amazon retail, and the stock is held in an FBA warehouse. Products are Prime eligible, and if a brand is a vendor, it means that they're paying vendor fees in exchange for Amazon retail to essentially handle the sales process for them. Then the second seller is a seller, meaning a branded manufacturer is either selling themselves as FBA on Amazon, or some sort of a brand is opening a seller central account, and that's kind of the difference in designation there. So the seller does hold ownership of the stock at an FBA warehouse, which also means that the products will be Prime eligible. The product listing will look a little bit different than the vendor side, as it'll show sold by blank, whatever that branded manufacturer's name is, and then fulfilled by Amazon. A seller is still required to pay fees to Amazon, which come in the form of FBA fees and storage fees. And they can also take the form of an FBM or a fulfilled by merchant selling entity. So then the final seller to review is a retailer, which is it's essentially synonymous with a third-party retailer. They function almost exactly as a seller. However, the huge difference here is the retailer is not the branded manufacturer. And how a retailer obtains stock does come in a few different ways. They are primarily purchasing directly from the manufacturer or a distributor to turn and then sell on Amazon. So really the foundation difference to note here is a retailer is not the manufacturer. And once they take ownership of a product, they have complete control of how that brand's products is listed, advertised, and actually sold on Amazon.
And so just to clarify as well, in for the purposes of this conversation today, we're not also going to be talking about situations where a brand has unauthorized resellers of their products, right? That's kind of like that's an unauthorized relationship that someone's either picking up inventory that's fallen off the back of a truck or gotten through a distributor, or it could be, there's something that the brand usually doesn't like about that relationship. But for the purpose of this conversation, we're talking about a partnership between a brand and a reseller or a retailer.
Absolutely. And it can, a retailer can exist in both forms, and we'll kind of touch on that a little bit as we go through. But yes, for this discussion, it really is looking at retail partners that have been chosen or allowed onto the platform in some way. So that's a great lead into this slide. This screen grab is a great visual example of the difference between the sellers and how you can really place each based on just looking at the buy box offering. So this brand is Steve Madden. Most of you, I'm sure, have heard of him at some point in time. And just looking at this listing offering, there are 4 sellers within the listing. One's a drop shipper. We know that because there's no Prime badge. 2 are FBA sellers, and then the last is a vendor offering. So in just looking at the buy box, it's kind of tough to tell exactly what's going on here, but we could make an assumption that Steve Madden is selling their stock directly to Amazon through the vendor portal, making them an authorized retailer of the products. When it comes to large brands like someone like Steve Madden, it's pretty common for them to use a distributor. Many third-party retailers will actually purchase through a distributor versus directly from the manufacturer. We'll kind of dive into why that matters a little more later, but just wanted to call it out quickly while we are reviewing seller differences. And then the 2 FBA sellers that we're seeing in the listing could either be considered squatters or unauthorized sellers, or they're just simply additional retailers that are allowed to exist on the platform by buying direct through Steve Madden or a distributor. And even same with that dropship seller. So overall, this is a pretty common landscape that exists on Amazon, and just shows how a brand can use a retailer as a partner, or they can kind of exist in the form of a squatter.
Right. So that's the Crush suppliers or Northside shoes and apparel. They could be authorized retailers or potentially unauthorized.
Yep, exactly. Great. So looking a little bit deeper at an actual retail partner and kind of how this all fits into the mix, I just pulled one of the larger retailers that happens to be on the platform. I did a little digging too, just out of curiosity more than anything else. But this retailer was actually launched in 1999 as an online-only footwear retailer, and then subsequently joined the Amazon platform. But they do sell the top brands like Adidas, UGG, and Fry. So it's safe to assume that they have some sort of an agreement with footwear manufacturers to sell their products, whether, again, it's buying direct or through an authorized distributor. But trying to just understand why, brands do partner with retailers, the benefits, the pros and the cons, is what this discussion is about. But if we're looking at this retailer, Shoe Mall, and trying to understand how they're partnering with brands, in looking at their product offering, there are some pretty big brands in there. So just focusing on Adidas for purposes of this discussion, they're pretty set on the brand recognition front, and they're really just focused on being as many places as possible. So my guess is they're working through distributors, and then retailers like Shoe Mall are able to purchase product as often as they'd like. It allows Adidas to expand their reach and the retailer to make a profit because it's easy to expand on behalf of the brand. However, there are tactics used to push sales that may not always align with the brand standards, and that will be kind of a theme we talk about here today. But I just threw a quick example up on the screen there for you just to show a pretty common example of a tactic that's used to push sales, and that is a decrease in price. I don't know if Fry has map on this product, but just simply looking at the two side by side, you can see the same product is being offered for 5 cents lower on Amazon when it's being sold by Shoe Mall versus how the actual manufacturer has the price designated on their direct site. So the lowered price obviously, increases incentive for the consumer to purchase, but it kind of does so at the cost of the brand's image.
Yeah, and that's a pretty low risk example. It's really 5 cents less than what the price is shown on the website. But obviously, we've seen a lot of examples where there is significant price erosion on Amazon for various reasons. One of them being competition from retailers.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great point. And it's a pretty common rule, not necessarily a rule, it's the reality in the retailing world that they function on high volume, low margin. And so a lot of times those tactics are, dropping the price to make sure that that volume stays consistent.
Yeah. So I wanted to give a little bit of context here about what kind of volume we're seeing from retailers versus brands on Amazon, and what we know about the Amazon unit volume is that about half of unit volume on Amazon now is done through sellers. So as opposed to first party vendor central relationships where Amazon has a relationship directly with the brand and purchases inventory from them with POs, we know that about half of the sales volume on Amazon's from sellers on Seller Central. And then if we look at this table, which shows us the top 10 sellers on Amazon ranked by how much feedback they've received in the last 12 months, we're able to see that 6 out of 10 of these sellers are retailers as opposed to a brand primarily selling their own product. And so just a note on this data set, of course, customer feedback isn't a direct measure of revenue or success or unit sales, but it is a pretty good indicator of sales volume, given that a certain percentage of customers end up leaving feedback. And it's just a good way for us to kind of make comparisons between the volume that sellers are doing on Amazon. But this is just to give a little bit more context on how much volume retailers actually do on Amazon. So let's move into why brands do partner with third-party retailers. And these are kind of what are the pros of working with a retailer? And the first one is that a retail partner can focus exclusively on a marketplace. And this, to me, like in a word, it's really about mind share. Like I said at the top of the webinar, Amazon's really like learning a whole new language if you're going to be fluent in their terms of service and what are the best practices for optimizing for SEO and PPC campaigns, and what are all the rules around how quickly you have to respond to customer messages. It's a whole new ecosystem that's quite difficult to navigate. And staying up to date with what is going on with Amazon and best practices, and even other marketplaces as well, like eBay, Walmart, Jet.com. Usually they all have their own quirks in their systems as well. So these retail partners have an established playbook for Amazon, for Walmart, for eBay. They know what they're doing. And so many brands see essentially hiring a third-party retailer as a great way to accomplish having a brand manager partner that can focus entirely on that marketplace. And so the alluring promise here is that brands can avoid talking to seller support and looking like the guy in this picture.
Been there. Feel that, man. Yeah, so that's a great point, Kiri. And I think one of the largest bonus points in working with a retailer is just visibility into other platforms, because it's exactly what you said. They all have their own nuance. So while Amazon is online retail's 800-pound gorilla, other sites like eBay, Amazon Global, Walmart, they do have shoppers that are worth tapping into, and a retailer is perfect for doing that. They can help a brand expand without being expensive. So kind of just starting down this list, looking at the bullets. The larger third-party retailers in this space typically already have a multi-marketplace presence, and they're selling other brands, they're selling other products. They've essentially taken it upon themselves to build these relationships, put in place the order systems that correspond to each marketplace, and then go as far as actually understanding the strategies for each. And all you have to do as a brand to gain access to all of that is sell to a retailer. Additionally, a brand can really align their messaging by choosing one retailer that represents them across all platforms. Like I said, large retailers can partner to set up fulfillment, shipping options correctly on the brand's behalf, because they're taking care of the legwork, as well as even advertising on each marketplace while staying on top of advertising ROI, ACoS, spend, as well as stock reviews, customer feedback, returns, which really does leave the brand a lot of freedom to focus on the manufacturing side and product development, which is what the brands are best at.
Yeah.
Yeah, and also if you look at kind of the risk side, to keep going down the list here a little bit here, thinking of this in terms of the brand, let's say the brand wants to expand to Walmart. As the brand owner, you're required to apply in order to sell on Walmart, actually set up an account through their seller center, and then integrate that catalog with Walmart. So those are 3 seemingly easy steps, but we all know that it will take a lot more time and energy. Even just learning the shipping side of Walmart, for any of the brands out there that already sell themselves on Amazon, those intense shipping requirements and how much of a headache it can be. So in thinking about just adding Walmart to the mix and the shipping requirements of just that additional marketplace, it really does kind of come to light how a retail partner can be pretty beneficial to a brand. And this only increases if we look at it on a global scale. Logistics like shipping requirements, importing and exporting. If you have a third-party partner, oftentimes they will take on all of those costs and all of that legwork for you. And I've seen it be more common than not. And they also will handle, transactions and exchange rates and the customer returns. If there's a bunch of returns in the UK, it's on that retailer to figure out what to do with that. So, overall, the benefits of having a 3P or a retailer, take your brand to new marketplaces, it's a little hard to pass up, but it should be pretty well thought out and make sure that it really does align with your Amazon goals as well.
So another reason why brands choose to partner with a third-party retailer is to maintain healthy margins. So the Amazon marketplace is often known as a race to zero effect, like we saw in the earlier example that Britt had of the shoe polish, where everyone sort of was holding steady at $9.95. But what can happen is, with so many sellers fighting for buyer attention on Amazon, low prices are one way to stand out, because that keeps inventory moving and helps to minimize storage fees. But between the competitive pricing that you may need to offer as a seller and paying all of Amazon's fees, there can be a razor thin margin of profit. But when a brand sells to a third-party retailer, the brand's profit margin may actually widen. Your costs are more fixed. You know what price you're going to be able to sell to the retailer at, and you're able to hold that margin. It's something that you can calculate. It's consistent. You're not dealing with unexpected fees from returns or chargebacks or unexpected things that crop up that can erode your margins. So what happens when you're selling to a retailer, at least, is that you would set your wholesale price for each SKU. And if the retailer wants to have an inventory commitment, they will pay that price that you've already set. Once the brand has gotten their cut, it's up to the third-party retailer to deal with fees and pricing. So with Amazon, FBA fees or shipping fees if they're not using FBA, things like marketing expenses, chargebacks, all of that kind of stuff. That's now the retailer's job to go ahead and figure out and make sure that they are making a profit. So you can often protect your brand's margin more consistently and predictably if you're working with a third-party retailer.
Optimizations are also a huge pro when we're looking at how a retailer can partner with a brand and make a pretty big difference. In my experience working at a retailer and then just partnering with other retailers in the space, it is a pretty common practice to offer optimization at no cost for the brands that retailers are working with. And the reason being is they reap the benefits as well. They're selling the product on Amazon, so it makes sense for them to kind of take on the legwork to optimize those listing and campaigns. And there are some retailers that will actually go as far as covering paid advertising costs. Obviously certain circumstances, but I have seen both of those in my time in the retailing space, which is a huge value add, especially for brands that are really unsure of how to message themselves on Marketplace and just have a higher learning curve in general when it comes to Amazon. Retailers know Marketplace, so they know how to reach, they know how to educate a shopper and do so correctly. And they have strategies on how to competitively target and achieve like marketplace specific goals by using tools like Amazon marketing, which can be, sponsored products, sponsored brand ads, and then turning on promotions like coupons and giveaways. They also know how to implement marketplace SEO tactics to achieve just a higher organic search results placement by doing things like implementing keywords, building A+ and enhanced brand content, creating a storefront to showcase a brand's vision, and then running promotions that purposefully kind of tap into that segment of deal hunters that can be found on Amazon. Obviously, a brand can do all of this, but it does take time and resources to execute. Something to note, though, this script can flip. So depending on the size and influence a retailer has, they may request brands to fund the majority of the optimization. So again, in my experience, the red carpet would easily roll out for larger brands that could essentially guarantee sales to the retailer. However, if you were a smaller brand and the retailer was kind of taking a risk in partnering with you, then that brand could expect to pay for advertising costs and likely optimizations as well.
Interesting. So it can come that the extra mile can come at a fee, I guess.
Yep, exactly. And it really just comes down to that underlying factor that it is high volume, low margin. So the retailer is going to be constantly thinking about how quickly is this brand's products going to move for me. If you can't really prove that, you could foot the bill, unfortunately.
Got it.
Great. So moving on into the cons of this, and we certainly don't want to overshadow any of the good that a retail partner can bring to a brand. But there are just naturally some cons that I think it's important to review, and they really do play a pretty integral part of the decision-making process in moving forward with a third-party retailer on the brand's behalf. So probably the largest piece to this and a theme that we've kind of been hinting at thus far is loss of control over your brand's image. And unfortunately, this will affect every single brand, but it may not affect them in the same way. So to just really understand kind of what's at stake, these are common issues that I saw in my time at a retailer and just doing some research that there's a few common themes here. So the first is lack of advertising collaboration. This is a biggie, and you really do risk a misalignment and disruption of your high-level advertising goal. So, for example, when I was working at the retailer, our advertising team would take an ROI approach, even though the direction from our brands sometimes would be they want to spend for sales. So use the full budget. We want to pay for real estate, and that was their approach to advertising. But the retailer's approach was ROI. So this would typically result in spending, sometimes only 30% of their budget each month, which would cause friction because, the retailer's metrics at that point was coming before the brand. So the collaboration piece is pretty tricky.
So that would be a big issue in a scenario where, let's say, a brand, I think that you're going to get to this later, so sorry if I'm previewing a little bit, but if you had a new product that you wanted to launch and you were prepared to spend, the required budget on that for advertising, then that may not always be how the retailer would see it as well, because they're more interested in the ROI approach.
Yep, exactly. Again, they're having to watch their margins pretty close. So if they're utilizing their internal advertising team's time to run marketing campaigns on behalf of brands where they don't expect to see a lot of return, they could easily change the strategy and you don't have a ton of say in it. So that's a great example. Another kind of con in this space is the inability to target consumers and, in conjunction, the loss of customer data. These really play into one another, so we'll kind of tackle them together. But if a retailer is selling your products, the brand doesn't know who and where the customers are purchasing. And you cannot use that data for any sort of retargeting measures. So this can really affect how a brand markets to new shoppers on their direct sites or their social channels. And that essentially means that it limits the brand and their ability to fill the sales funnel and consistently find new business. Again, kind of
how is that different to, like, if you were going to be selling directly on Amazon? Or is there a difference there?
Yeah, that's a great question. So if you were to sell yourself or FBA yourself on Amazon, you would have your Seller Central sales data to tap into. So if I was a water bottle manufacturer and I was selling myself, I could see what my sales were and some of that customer data. Now, if it's a retailer selling that product, they're not necessarily obligated to give you any sales insight.
Right.
Especially not to that granular level. So it just makes it really difficult because you're essentially handing over the data of your products to someone else, and then they decipher, how they provide that back to you.
Got it. Okay. Yep.
So that's a great segue into this next point, which is you don't have any insight into sales. So exactly what we were just saying. But not knowing sales on Amazon, which does see over 50% of all online transactions, means that your manufacturing, your budgets, your planning, and pretty much your overall business strategy could be affected. An example of this, if your brand is selling really well on Amazon.com, but your retailer isn't sharing any of that information, obviously you're seeing, POs come through pretty quickly, but you could run out of stock. And it doesn't only affect your Amazon presence, but it can affect your brick and mortar footprint as well. If your brick and mortar retailer partners aren't able to purchase as they'd like, it could, create rough waters for those relationships as well. And, that's hard to turn on reactionary measures. If you don't know really what's going on and you don't have time on your side to ramp up manufacturing or come up with some sort of creative solution, it really does minimize your ability to be reactionary. Next up, looking at, your voice and how it's lost in exactly how your brand is displayed when you kind of are giving that power to a retailer. And this really is the overarching theme of this whole presentation and very self-explanatory. But if a brand is selling to a retailer, they lose control of how the retailer portrays the brand to the consumer. They can play with things like price, images, listing content, even guarantees. They can do pretty much whatever they want to because they have ownership of that stock and essentially the brand at that point.
Right.
And so we'll talk about distributors really quickly, and then the last two bullets we'll cover on the next slide because they're pretty meat and potatoes all on their own. But just to kind of dip our toe into the distributor water, there's a handful of ways that a distributor can affect a brand. So I'll just really quickly run through what I've seen in my experience. There are both great and terrible distributors out there. The great ones are an awesome partner for a brand, especially ones that want to expand and not necessarily deal with the logistics of selling direct. However, the bad ones can create kind of a mess for a brand. So the biggest piece to this is most distributors do not follow a pricing policy. So if your brand has MAP, you can expect that once a distributor sells to a retailer, there is a chance that that policy could go right out the window. And a retailer's stance is likely going to be, hey, you know, I bought the product from a distributor. There wasn't any pricing policy when I purchased the stock. Therefore, I'm not obligated to follow your pricing policy. Another issue can be with shipping and packaging. You know, if a customer receives damaged product, they're going after the brand. They're not going to go after the retailer or the distributor, most likely. And then kind of last note on this is not every distributor is going to follow the brand's guidelines. It's very common for a lot of brands to set up distribution policies, and it's something that I always kind of shout to the mountaintop, you should have that. But, you know, even if a brand says as a part of their distribution policy that they do not allow third-party sellers of their products, oftentimes distributors could see that as a loss in profit, you know, especially if they have a retailer that's waving a purchase order in their face, they may kind of falter and end up fulfilling that order anyway. So some issues there for sure.
And so with your point about distributors, Brittany, maybe it's worth sort of separating, like with distributors versus retailers, which we're talking about today. What's sort of the chain, the general chain there? Do we see brands selling to a distributor who then sells to a retailer, or brands that sell to a retailer and then distributors end up getting their hands on it? Or are those just kind of two separate models that a brand would look to employ, distributor versus retailer?
Yeah, that's a great question. Not as much the latter option. It is primarily a retailer buying from a distributor and then that retailer reselling the product. There are just so many huge brands out there, or brands that just prefer to work with a distributor. So they just kind of made the middleman essentially. I didn't really see too many instances in which us as the retailer, when I was working there, would then turn around and sell back to a distributor. So I'm not saying it doesn't happen, but it isn't quite as common.
Okay. So this is more of a, like when we're talking about distributors, there's less of a relationship between the brand and the distributor, and certainly the end seller, than if a brand is looking to set up a partnership with a retailer directly.
Precisely. Yep.
Got it.
Awesome. And then moving on to pricing issues, which will be the next slide, we can kind of dive into, you know, how that plays into some of the cons that we just discussed for loss of brand control.
All right, great. So one thing that is a huge issue for brands is pricing, or at least a consideration. And so with pricing a product that tells customers a lot about the positioning of your brand, the level of quality that they can expect. Pricing tells a big story for a brand about their products. Pricing also has impacts on your other channels. If you're a brand that sells to brick and mortar retail, it can create a lot of conflict with that retailer if they end up seeing your products on Amazon for a lower price than what they're allowed to sell them at. So both from a brand and positioning standpoint and a channel conflict standpoint, pricing is a big pain point for brands when they're looking at marketplaces like Amazon. And so this is why, like Brittany said, she's always talking about online distribution agreements and MAP policies, or minimum advertised price policies, because these can actually, when they're put in place with a partner and they're actually going to adhere to it, it can be helpful to keep pricing consistent between Amazon and your other channels. But just because you've created that MAP policy and an online distribution agreement with a retailer, it doesn't mean that you can walk away and trust that they're going to do everything perfectly. You still need to have someone on your team or some kind of system or process to continually just monitor what the retailer is doing and make sure that they are actually holding to their agreement. Unauthorized lowball pricing can create doubt in the minds of shoppers, and they may worry that a product is counterfeit or there might be something else wrong with it. So the ways that pricing can be eroded on Amazon, the other little bubble that I've got up on this screen here is around repricing software. And that's just another way that sellers on Amazon ultimately start competing with each other for the sale if they're constantly repricing products. And that's where if you're working with a retailer and they're not, if they're using a repricing software or they're not really accountable to your MAP policy or online distribution agreement, that's when things start to escalate and the price starts spiraling down. And unless the brand is actually really watching what the retailer's up to, it can get out of control.
So another pretty large con in partnering with a retailer would be this kind of cherry picking thing that seems to happen in this space. So obviously it would be great if every single retail partner purchased your whole catalog from the brand standpoint. But unfortunately, that just doesn't happen. And that's just sort of the way that retailers act within the ecosystem. They have some different objectives, and I think it's just kind of important to note some of those. The first is, kind of understanding why retailers cherry pick. And the simple fact is they're the ones holding the inventory. So ultimately, they're the ones paying the storage fees. And we know that the number one killer of retail is stagnant inventory. And given, margins are so slim already, retailers can't risk buying inventory that isn't going to sell fast. And coupled with the recent change in Amazon's long-term storage fee structure and the increased frequency of that fee assessment, retailers can't risk buying high volume or any SKUs that just can't be guaranteed to sell. But there are ways to combat this. During my time working with a retailer, I saw multiple techniques to get creative and really combat that style of buying. So I just wanted to share some of my favorites, and hopefully this is helpful to any of the brands out there in working with a retail partner. So the first is an example. One of the toy brands I worked with, they were pretty big in the toy vertical. They had 15-page contracts that every distributor, retailer, brick and mortar retailer were required to sign and abide by. So part of it was a MAP policy, part of it was distribution policy. Yeah, it was a meaty document. And I think there was kind of a fear tactic in just making sure that it looked like a small book. But it worked. And part of this contract was a clause that said if you were an online-only retailer, you were required to carry a minimum of 100 SKUs at any given time. And within that 100 SKUs, there had to be a subset that counted across each of their 10 lines. This was a really big brand, so they could request something like that. But, it was effective in ensuring a larger percent of their catalog was purchased on a consistent basis. So obviously modify that for smaller brands, but it was a pretty impressive technique. And just a couple other ones to share, setting up MOQs and annual commitments. I would say at least 85% of the brands I worked with had some form of an MOQ. Sometimes it would just be for initial orders. For example, the first order had to be 5K, and then subsequent orders needed to hit 1K. Other brands would set up more of a unit commitment. For example, every order has to be a minimum of 100 units. Some larger brands I worked with actually required a container MOQ, which is an extremely effective tactic if you're a brand trying to weed out the little guys and only work with large retailers in this space. And then on the annual commitment side, I had one of my brands require $100,000 a year purchase requirement. And if us as the retailer didn't hold up our end of the deal and purchase that required amount, we wouldn't be allowed to sell the brand moving forward. So another solid technique in getting retailers to pick up additional product. And then the last one to touch on is rebate programs, which may not be for every single brand, but it is a unique incentive. this tactic was a little more common with the brands I worked with that liked and really wanted to keep a large variety of retail partners. So they would create something that would be like, if the retailer purchased $50,000 in the first 6 months, then that retailer could expect to see a rebate of $500 on their next PO or things like that. So obviously that's not a technique that's workable for every single brand, but it was pretty helpful for the brands that I partnered with that were kind of facing this cherry picking issue.
Yeah, this is interesting because you've sort of identified some ways that brands could avoid that situation, but it does seem like there is almost as much monitoring of the agreement and the relationship required as if you're going to actually manage things yourself in some of these cases.
Absolutely. You got to find how much of a pain point this is and then what you're going to invest afterwards.
Right. So one final con for working with a retailer is reselling stagnant inventory. So here, once you sell your product to a third-party retailer, you can't be absolutely certain what happens to it next. If a retailer purchased too much inventory and finds themselves facing long-term storage fees with Amazon, or just generally having tied their capital up with excess inventory, they may decide to ultimately cut their losses and sell to another reseller or liquidate the inventory. So this essentially opens up your brand and your products and inventory to the highest bidder, and that entity doesn't have even the relationship that you have with a retailer and the agreements that you've come to, regardless of how well they're enforced. You have no relationship to whoever just bought your inventory, and they will, can do with it what they please. And so this is where we see a brand's products ending up on unapproved marketplaces. It's quite common for retailers to liquidate stock on eBay, Wish, Craigslist, selling it to, in warehouse sales, things like that, anything to clear out stagnant inventory and regain a bit of capital and a bit of space. So the fact that your products are on these marketplaces, the fact that they might be sold again for a lower price is going to have an impact on your brand image. And so with all that, we've gone through 4 pros and 4 cons. I want to talk about some of the alternatives here. Like I mentioned at the top of the webinar, at Bobsled Marketing, we are an agency that works with brands to implement their Amazon channel. The other solution that you have as opposed to retailers is having an internal team. So I'll just quickly address, again, the pros and cons of these 2 options here. With an internal team, the pros are obviously institutional knowledge. So this is that the internal team understands your brand, knows about the products, they have that existing knowledge and understanding of the brand, but then they're also going to, as they develop their Amazon expertise and capabilities, that's something that you can rely on internally within the company. And you could expect that they're going to be developing processes and systems, and you're going to start to build this muscle within your company that you can rely on. Another pro is that there's potentially a lower cost if you have an Amazon or marketplace operation that's at a level of scale that justifies having team members devoted to Amazon. And so if you're a $1 million company just doing $1 million a year, it's unlikely that you're going to really have enough work for someone to do to manage your Amazon PPC campaigns all day. And so that's what you're looking for within Amazon. And we'll get into this a little bit coming up, but there are very distinct disciplines with managing an Amazon channel, and you really need to have people focused on those different disciplines. And it's difficult to get to that level of scale until you are turning over hundreds of millions of dollars on Amazon to make it worthwhile. The cons of using an internal team is just the ability to stay current on Amazon strategy and best practices. it is, changing all the time. If someone's just looking at one account, they have less exposure to what's going on other platforms and other industries. And then finally, the cost to hire, train, or replace individual people on your team, that comes at a cost as well. Now, if you work with an agency or consultants, it's really the reverse, pros and cons. The pros, minimal ramp-up time. If someone is on vacation or sick or leaves, and it's really an agency's job, and some consultants, but an agency's job to make that as seamless as possible, that your account is always covered. There's always someone to call. As an agency or a consultant, you also need to be focused on the best practices around Amazon. That's your job. It's what you do for a number of different clients working across lots of different accounts and platforms. So you get to see a huge volume of trends and effects, and able to test different types of hypotheses that you have about things that'll work and things that won't. The cons are potentially higher cost than having your own in-house team in some situations, as I mentioned, and institutional knowledge. Really, you're relying on the agency or the consultant to build the processes, the systems, figure out the software, that kind of stuff. If you need to leave the agency or terminate that relationship, all of that knowledge is sort of gone immediately. You don't get to retain any of that IP.
Great. So just to kind of back up everything that Kiri just said, and I'll hustle through this just to be conscious of time. But everything she talked about, is so vital in keeping the wheels turning. But let's take a more granular look at everything that's required to truly stay afloat on Amazon and ensure that your brand integrity is upheld and that you're actually visible on the platform. So whether or not you have an agency partner that is going to take care of these things, someone in your internal team needs to be looking at the things that I'm going to blast through here really quickly, but not almost, on a daily basis. These things should be looked at in some way, shape, or form to ensure that you're being found on Amazon and that your business is functioning properly. So just going through PPC, the advertising side of things, you should have an internal team that is managing and optimizing your campaigns, whether it's AMS, DSP, and ensuring that there is a strategic focus on marketplace shoppers, looking at ACoS, ROI, campaign spend, negative spend, managing promotions like promo codes, best deals, coupons, and then ensuring that your campaigns are optimized based on any catalog changes, and then seasonality. So planning for Black Friday and Cyber Monday, things like that. And then on the organic marketing side, having a team in place to handle optimizations for front and back end, strategic keyword implementation, having a storefront, having EBC, A+ content, and then having an ongoing optimization schedule to ensure consistent improvements across all of those organic marketing deliverables, if you will. And then on the brand protection side, there needs to be a daily review for unauthorized sellers and listings, following up on cease and desist letters, conducting test buys, tracking down unknown squatters and counterfeiters, definitely responding to reviews and any consumer questions. Having it come directly from the manufacturer is our recommendation for best practices, as well as checking reviews for handset counterfeit or product issues. And then finally, staying on top of those MAP policies and distribution policies. Then the final piece to our iceberg here is the operations side. So ensuring that you have a team that is checking for shipments, problem receive rate percentages, chargebacks on the vendor side, returns, case logs, purchase orders, invoicing, everything that it takes to keep a well-oiled machine functioning on Amazon.
Good stuff. Yeah, it's quite a mouthful to get through this slide, because it is sort of a dump of all of the activities that certainly we deal with on behalf of our clients at Bobsled. And even if you're not going to be using an agency, this is sort of a laundry list of things that someone, like you said, someone needs to be thinking about, whether that's the retailer that you're working with internally at your company or working with an agency or a consultant. There's just a huge volume of activities and things that need to be visited, watched, monitored, optimized over time. So just wanted to give a quick overview here of what our solutions are at Bobsled Marketing. So we are an agency that works on behalf of our clients through their Seller Central or Vendor Central account. So the client, the brand, retains their own account, and we're sort of in there giving guidance, optimizing campaigns, optimizing product listings, things like that. And this is a map of the various solutions that we have for our clients. It ranges from more of a one-time or periodical view into your account to give insights through account audits and projects, training, quarterly reviews. We also have a lot of clients who have an existing team. They're pretty advanced. They know what they're doing day to day, but they want to have a level of strategic insight come in where they're able to access an experienced person working across a great number of accounts and ask them questions about strategy and trends that they're seeing and new programs and even very specific issues. And that's where we find a coaching model to be really helpful. And then what we've done for a long time, for the last 4 years, is our done for you services, where we're actually setting the strategy, but then also implementing all of our recommendations across all those things that Brittany mentioned: PPC advertising, organic marketing, brand protection, and operations. So that is, on a page, pretty much everything that we do. And we are on pretty close to wrapping up now.
Yeah, 3 minutes to spare. So if there's any questions, doesn't look like there's any on the chat field. But, if you guys have questions after the fact, after you've soaked up all this beautiful knowledge and thought about things that maybe you're interested in, or you want more insider information, or you are interested in looking closer at Bobsled services and partnering with us, my contact information is up there on the screen. Please don't hesitate to shoot me an email. We're happy to be, even just a resource to the brands out there, if nothing else. So keep following our webinars, our podcasts, and I hope we can connect at some point in the future.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.